The city of Blackreach never slept. Not really. The neon signs buzzed like dying fireflies, flickering against the rain-slick pavement. The air smelled like cheap whiskey, unspoken secrets, and something else, something rotten, just beneath the surface. I lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, watching the smoke curl against the cold glass of my office window. Cases came and went, but this one was different. The dame had walked in just past midnight, draped in crimson velvet and perfume, so expensive it could buy a soul. Her eyes weren't human. "I need you to find someone," she had said, her voice the kind that could melt men like candle wax. "Yeah." I leaned back in my chair, pretending the room wasn't getting colder by the second. "Who's the unlucky guy?" Her painted lips barely moved. "Me." I should have told her to get the hell out. I should have ignored the way the shadows in the room twitched when she spoke, or the fact that I could no longer hear the city outside. But I didn't. It had been a long night. The kind that sank into your bones, left a taste of old whiskey and bad choices on your tongue. She didn't give me a name. Didn't say where she came from or how she found me. Only that she had been here before, that she should exist, but didn't. I asked the usual questions, but all I got were riddles. I should have sent her back into the rain. Should have left whatever madness she carried on the other side of my door. But something in her smile, the way it didn't quite reach her eyes, made me hesitate. Then, just like that, she was gone. I sat in my chair for a long time, staring at the cigarette burning between my fingers. The air still smelled like her perfume. That was when the phone rang. Not my office phone, the private one. I let it ring twice before answering. Monroe. A low chuckle on the other end, deep, smooth, dangerous. "Got yourself a new case," the voice said. It wasn't a question. I exhaled smoke. "Didn't know my business interested you, Carmine." Carmine Angelo. The kind of man who didn't ask twice. He ran half of Blackreach from the shadows, pulling strings with fingers dipped in blood and old magic. If you owed him money, you either paid up or ended up floating in the canal with your lungs full of dirty water. I owed him nothing. But that didn't mean he wouldn't collect anyway. "Your business doesn't interest me," he said. "Your survival does." I frowned. Carmine didn't make threats. Not the empty kind, at least. "You're telling me to walk away." "I'm telling you to stop before you find something you can't put back." I crushed the cigarette into the ashtray. "See, the funny thing about that, I don't even know what I'm looking for yet." Silence stretched between us. Then, that same low chuckle. "You will." Click. I stared at the receiver for a long moment before setting it down. The rain hit the window in slow, steady taps, like fingernails against glass. Somewhere in the city, a woman in red was disappearing into the dark. And somehow, some way, Carmine already knew why. I left my office feeling the weight of 1,000 bad decisions pressing against my ribs. The city breathed different that night. The neon signs still hummed, the gutters still carried the stink of old rain and cheap liquor, but something else had slipped between the cracks, something watching. Carmine didn't issue warnings for fun. He wanted me to drop the case. Wanted it bad. Which meant it wasn't just trouble. It was the kind of trouble that didn't stay buried. I pulled my coat tighter against the wind and started walking. Blackreach had a way of swallowing you whole if you weren't careful. Too many alleys where things moved that weren't supposed to. Too many streetlights that flickered and never came back on. Tonight was no different. 2 blocks down, I felt it, a presence, a weight behind my shoulder blades, just out of reach. I stopped at a street corner, fishing out my lighter like I was just another tired bastard looking for a smoke. The brass casing reflected a quick glimpse behind me. 2 shadows where there should have been 1. I wasn't alone. I exhaled, letting the cigarette burn slow. Didn't turn around. Rule number 1 in Blackreach: if you see something that shouldn't be there, pretend you don't. Instead, I kept walking, cutting left down a narrow alley between an old bookstore and a pawn shop that smelled like rusted metal and broken dreams. The rain had slowed, but the air was thick. Too thick. The second I stepped into the alley, the presence moved closer. Footsteps, deliberate and soundless. I adjusted the knife in my pocket. "If you're gonna kill me," I muttered, "at least buy me a drink first." No answer. The footsteps stopped. I turned. Nothing there. Just the alley. Just the old brick walls, the graffiti curling like dead veins, the dim glow of a street lamp that barely touched the dark. And then, the shadows shifted. Something peeled itself away from the wall. Tall. Wrong. A shape where no shape should be. I took a step back, my fingers tightening around the hilt of the knife. Cold flooded my lungs. My breath curled in front of me like I'd just stepped into a freezer. Not human. I swallowed hard. "Carmine send you." The thing didn't answer. Didn't move. Just stood there, a shape cut out of the world, like a piece of night had decided to walk. Then, a whisper. Low. Guttural. Like 100 voices speaking through wet gravel. Turn back, detective. My pulse slammed against my ribs, but I kept my voice steady. Or what? A pause. Then, the thing smiled. A split in the dark, stretching too wide, too sharp. Teeth where teeth didn't belong, or you won't find your way back. The street lamp flickered, and the thing was gone. Like it had never been there. But the alley was still too cold. And I knew, deep in my gut, that the shadows weren't empty anymore. I didn't go home. Not after that. Some things in Blackreach didn't just follow you, they sank their teeth in and didn't let go. And whatever the hell that thing in the alley was, it had teeth to spare. I needed answers. I needed protection. And that meant finding Father Vincent. He wasn't your typical priest. No warm smiles or kind words. No sermons about redemption. Just a man in a tattered black cassock, smelling of candle wax and bad coffee, with too many scars and too little faith left in his bones. He ran St. Augustine's, a church that had stood in Blackreach longer than most buildings, but nobody ever went there to pray. They went there because they had nowhere else left to run. I knew Vincent from back when I was still a cop. Before I quit. Before I saw too much. He was the guy you called when things got ugly, the kind of ugly that didn't bleed normal, didn't die normal. And if he couldn't fix it, then at least he could tell you what you were up against. I found him where I always did, sitting in the back pew of St. Augustine's, nursing a cigarette in the dark. Monroe, he muttered as I stepped inside, not even looking up. Must be bad if you're coming here. I took a seat beside him, my fingers still cold from whatever the hell I'd just met in that alley. You tell me. I exhaled slow. Ever heard of something that moves like a shadow, talks like the dead, and smiles like a shark? Vincent didn't flinch, didn't even hesitate. That scared me more than anything. Yeah, he said, I have. His fingers traced a long scar on his palm, like he was remembering something he didn't want to. I waited. Finally, he spoke. You ever heard of a hollow man? I frowned. Sounds like a bad horror story. It is, Vincent muttered. And like all horror stories, it starts with something worse. He took a slow drag of his cigarette, watching the smoke curl into the candlelight. It starts with a deal. I never trusted churches. Maybe it was the way they always smelled like something old, not just incense and candle wax, but dust thick with forgotten prayers. Maybe it was the way the air hung too still, like even God wasn't sure he belonged there anymore. Or maybe it was because places like this never stopped the monsters from coming in. The candles flickered. Not from the wind, there was no wind. The doors were shut, the air thick and unmoving. But the flames trembled like something had breathed over them. Vincent saw it too. His cigarette still between his fingers, his shoulders stiffened. Then, the temperature dropped. Not the kind of cold that seeped in from outside, but something deeper. Something wrong. The feeling of being watched. Vincent muttered something under his breath, too quiet for me to catch. Then he was moving. Fast, smoother than any priest had the right to be. He grabbed the old iron crucifix from the altar, his grip tight enough to whiten his knuckles. Something followed you. I clenched my jaw. Yeah, noticed that. The church groaned. Wood, old and heavy, bending against something unseen. Then, a whisper. Low. Wet. Crawling through the cracks in the stone. You should have listened. A shadow stretched across the floor, pulling from nowhere, spreading slow. It was wrong, too black, too deep, like an open grave swallowing the light. And then, it started to rise. A shape peeling itself out of the dark, stretching, unfolding, becoming. I took a step back, my fingers already reaching for the knife in my coat. Vincent didn't move. Didn't blink. Instead, he raised the crucifix and slammed it into the ground. The candles roared to life, flames stretching twice their size. A rush of heat burned the cold back, pushing the shadow toward the far wall, but not out. Vincent turned his head, just enough to look at me. His voice was calm. Too calm. We don't have much time. The thing in the dark didn't like that. It didn't move like a man, it slithered, boneless, shifting like liquid shadow, folding itself wrong and too fast. I saw the mouth again. That too wide grin, full of teeth that didn't belong. It laughed. The sound twisted the air, warping the room. The walls stretched, the wooden beams overhead groaned. The candles flickered again, struggling, fighting against the dark. Vincent pulled something from his coat, a silver flask. He unscrewed the top with his teeth, took a quick swallow, then spat the rest at the thing. The moment the liquid hit the shadow, it screeched, a high, unnatural wail that made my skull ache. Not just whiskey, holy water. The hollow man writhed, its form splitting, twisting, unraveling like smoke caught in a storm, but it wasn't leaving. Not yet. Vincent's voice was sharp. We need to finish this. Now, the hollow man writhed, its blackened form twisting like a dying flame. The holy water had hurt it, but it hadn't driven it out. It laughed again, only this time, the sound was different. Weaker. Like it was unraveling. Like it was trying to hold itself together. Then, it whispered my name. Monroe. I went still. Not because it spoke, but because of how it spoke. Not the guttural rasp of something old and dead, but a voice beneath it. A second voice. A woman's voice. Soft. Familiar. Desperate. Help me. My breath hitched. Vincent stiffened beside me, his fingers tightening around the flask. Don't listen to it. But my heart was already hammering. That voice. It was hers. The woman in red. The woman who didn't exist. She was inside that thing. I took a slow step forward. The hollow man twitched, its form flickering like a bad film reel. It wasn't stable. Wasn't whole. Where are you? I asked, my throat dry. The darkness trembled. Then, the voice came again. Find me. The shadows lurched toward me. Fast, hungry, the air warping with them. Vincent moved quicker. His hand shot out, slamming the iron crucifix into my chest, knocking me backward. Move. The moment I hit the ground, Vincent threw a second flask. The glass shattered against the hollow man's shifting form. The reaction was instant. It screamed, a sound like splitting bone, like wind howling through a graveyard. The thing shrank back, coiling, burning, pieces of it breaking apart like peeling paint, and for just a second, I saw her. A face, half-formed, trapped within the black. She was trying to reach me. Then, the candles flickered. The darkness collapsed in on itself, and the hollow man was gone. But the silence it left behind felt heavier than the thing itself. Vincent was breathing hard, his flask empty, his knuckles wide around the crucifix. I sat up slowly, my pulse still hammering. She was in there, I said. She's still alive. Vincent ran a hand down his face. That wasn't living. I shook my head. She told me to find her, he sighed. Then she's somewhere worse. I swallowed. How much worse? Vincent exhaled through his nose. If a hollow man takes something, it means she never existed. He looked at me. And if she never existed, where the hell are you supposed to find her? I didn't have an answer. But I had a lead. The last thing she'd said to me before all of this started. Find me. If I wanted answers, I needed to go to the one man in black reach who always had them. Carmine Angelo. The gilded jackal was quieter than usual. That wasn't a good thing. It meant the wrong people were listening. I stepped inside, my boots slick with rain, and caught the usual mix of perfume, old bourbon, and cigarette smoke. The jazz band played something slow, something sad, but the music felt distant, like it was coming from another world. The bartender didn't even look at me. Just jerked his chin toward the back. Carmine was waiting. He sat in his usual booth, a glass of something dark in his hand. He looked like he always did, polished, untouchable, the kind of man who never bled unless he wanted to. But when he saw me, his fingers tightened around the glass. I slid into the seat across from him, shaking the rain from my coat. You look like you've seen a ghost, Carmine. He didn't smile. Didn't smirk. Didn't even pretend. Instead, he swirled his drink, watching the liquid move like ink. I told you to drop it, Monroe. Yeah, you did. I leaned forward. And now I know why. Carmine let out a slow breath, setting his drink down. Tell me, I said, how long have you known about the hollow men? The air between us shifted. Subtle. Cold. Like the room itself had stopped breathing. For a long moment, Carmine didn't answer. He just sat there, watching me with those dead black eyes. Then, finally, he reached up, unfastening the gold ring on his finger. He placed it between us. The stone in the center, darker than onyx, slick as oil, moved. Not a reflection. Something inside the stone. Something shifting. Too long, Carmine said softly. I felt the weight of those words. I glanced at the ring. What is it? He exhaled through his nose. Insurance. I didn't like the sound of that. Against what? Carmine met my gaze, forgetting. My stomach turned cold. I thought back to the hollow man, the shifting dark. The woman's voice inside it. Carmine saw the look in my eyes and nodded. Now you get it. My throat felt tight. The woman in red. Doesn't exist, he cut in. But I saw her, I said. I talked to her. And now? Carmine leaned forward, voice low. Where is she? I didn't answer. Because I didn't know. Carmine picked up his glass again. Took a slow sip. That's what they do, Monroe. They take people, erase them. Like they were never here. I clenched my fists. Then why do I still remember her? Carmine gave me a long, tired look. Then he tapped the ring. You ever wonder why I wear this? Realization dawned slow. He wasn't wearing it for power. He was wearing it because without it, he'd forget. The woman in red. The hollow men. All of it. I sat back, running a hand down my face. So, I muttered. You gonna tell me where to find her? Carmine tilted his head. Then, he laughed. Not his usual low chuckle. Not the kind of laugh that said he was in control. No. This laugh was bitter. When he finally stopped, he reached for his ring again. Slipped it back onto his finger. You don't find the hollow men, he said, voice quiet. They find you. I swallowed hard. And the people they take. Carmine's jaw tightened. You really want to know? I didn't like the way he said that. But I nodded anyway. The gunshot cracked through the bar like a bolt of lightning. Carmine barely had time to react. But I did. I dove left as the first shot tore through the leather booth where my head had been a second ago. Glass shattered. Someone screamed. The jazz band stopped playing. Carmine cursed, knocking over his drink as he ducked behind the table. He wasn't used to being the one caught off guard. I hit the floor hard, rolling behind the bar. My heart pounded, the weight of my revolver already familiar in my palm. The bartender, Charlie, cowered next to me, his eyes wide. What the hell did you do this time, Monroe? I asked the wrong questions, I muttered. Another shot rang out. The mirror behind the bar exploded, raining shards down over the whiskey bottles. I caught a quick glimpse in the jagged reflection, two figures near the entrance, both armed, both moving fast. They weren't Carmine's men, too sloppy, too eager to kill. Carmine was shouting something, but I wasn't listening. My focus was on the angle, on the rhythm of their shots. 3 seconds between them. 3 seconds to move. I counted the beats. 1. I took a breath. 2. I gripped my revolver tight. 3. I rose fast, gun leveled. I didn't hesitate. Bang. The first shot caught the nearest shooter in the shoulder, sending him staggering back against the wall. His gun clattered to the floor. He gasped, blood seeping between his fingers, eyes wide. The second guy, a tall bastard in a gray trench coat, turned on me fast. Too fast. I barely had time to move before he squeezed the trigger. Pain exploded through my side. Not deep, a graze, maybe, but enough to make me grit my teeth. I hit the ground, the impact rattling through me. Trench coat took a step closer, gun trained on me. Then, a second shot. Not mine. His head snapped back, a spray of crimson catching the light. Carmine stood behind him, gun still smoking. His eyes were colder than I'd ever seen them. Trench coat crumpled, the life already gone from his body before he hit the floor. The first guy, the one I winged, was crawling for his gun. Carmine walked over slow, like a goddamn executioner. The man on the floor looked up, blood on his lips, shaking hands raised. Please, he choked out. Carmine didn't blink. Bang. One shot. Right between the eyes. The bar fell silent. Even the dripping liquor from the broken bottle seemed too loud. Carmine exhaled, slipping his gun back inside his coat. Then, finally, he looked at me. You alright? I sat up slow, pressing a hand to my side. I was bleeding, but not bad. Yeah, I muttered, I've had worse. Carmine crouched beside me, his expression unreadable. These guys weren't mine, he said. I know, I grunted. His jaw tensed. Then that means someone else knows what you're digging into. He wasn't wrong. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was a hit. Someone didn't want me finding the woman in red. And they were willing to put me in the ground to make sure of it. I wiped the blood off my fingers and stood up slow. The gilded jackal was dead silent. The regulars were too smart to get involved, pretending they hadn't seen 2 bodies drop in less than a minute. Even the bartender, Charlie, had gone pale, but he wasn't stupid enough to call the cops. Carmine ran this place, and in Blackreach, the cops only came when they were told to. I ignored the ache in my side and stepped over the first corpse, the guy in the trench coat. He was still warm. You sure you want to do this? Carmine muttered, lighting a cigarette like nothing had happened. I crouched down, patting the guy's pockets. Somebody sent them. I want to know who. The dead man didn't have much, a lighter, a crumpled pack of smokes, a knife small enough to be hidden in his sleeve. But then, inside his coat, my fingers brushed against something stiff, a card. I pulled it out and turned it over. No name. No number. Just a symbol, printed in black ink. An eye. Wide open, surrounded by sharp jagged lines. I knew that symbol. Carmine saw my face and exhaled smoke through his nose. Yeah, he muttered. That's what I thought. I looked at him. The hollow men have friends now. He shook his head. Not friends. Clients. That made my stomach turn. The Eye of Vespara. A secret society. Older than the city. Richer than the law. They had their fingers in politics, business, the underground. And the one thing they were known for. They bought things that weren't for sale. People. Memories. Souls. And now, apparently, they were buying from the hollow men. I stood up, flipping the card between my fingers. Why would they want to stop me from finding her? Carmine took a slow drag of his cigarette. Maybe because she's already theirs. That stopped me cold. A lead weight settled in my gut. You think they took her? I asked. Carmine shrugged. I think if she's still alive, she ain't walking free. I clenched my jaw. The hollow men didn't just steal people. They erased them. But what if someone else was using them? What if the woman in red was still alive, just locked away somewhere no one was supposed to find her? I exhaled slow. That meant one thing. The Eye of Vespara didn't want me digging. And if they were willing to kill over it. I was getting close. I stared at the card in my hand, the Eye of Vespara staring back. Mocking me. Carmine was watching me close, waiting to see what I'd do next. He knew what this meant. Hell, we both did. I had two choices, run or dig deeper. And I wasn't running. I slipped the card into my coat. I need a name. Carmine exhaled slow, flicking ash from his cigarette. You're not gonna like it. I crossed my arms. Wouldn't be the first time. He smirked at that, but there was no humor in it. Then he leaned in, voice dropping low. Felix Greaves. I frowned. Felix is dead. Carmine's smirk widened. Yeah, he muttered. That's what they want you to think. Felix Greaves, a historian, a researcher. A goddamn genius. A guy who dug too deep into the wrong secrets and paid the price. Officially, he was dead. Died in a fire 6 years ago, burned beyond recognition. No body. No evidence. Just a name scratched off the books, unofficially. If anyone knew what the Eye of Vespara was doing with the hollow men, where they took the people they erased, it was Felix, if he was still alive. Carmine sighed, rubbing his jaw. Last I heard, he was still in Blackreach. I raised a brow. That's funny. Thought dead men didn't rent apartments. Carmine snorted. He doesn't. He lives off the grid. No ID, no paper trail. And you just happen to know where to find him. Carmine chuckled, but it was low, humorless. I don't, actually. But I know who does. I waited. He held my gaze. Harper Vale. I swore under my breath. Harper Vale wasn't just any informant. She was a fixer. A broker of secrets. She had dirt on half the city, and she charged in blood or favors, whichever was worth more. Carmine saw the look on my face and shrugged. Told you wouldn't like it. I ran a hand down my face. Where is she? Same place she always is, Carmine muttered. The Blue Orchid. I exhaled. That was gonna be a problem. The Blue Orchid wasn't just a bar. It was Eye of Vespara territory. Going there meant walking right into the lion's den. I looked at Carmine. You coming with me? He smirked. Nah. You're a big boy, Monroe. Besides, he leaned back, picking up his drink. I like to keep my head attached to my shoulders. I grunted. Fair enough. I turned to leave, then hesitated. You ever worked with the Eye before? I asked, watching him close. Carmine didn't answer right away. He just took a slow sip of his drink. Then, finally, he met my gaze. I make it a habit, he said, not to owe favors to devils. I nodded. Because now, I was about to. I wasn't going straight to the Blue Orchid. Not yet. Not before I knew what the hell I was walking into. If Felix Greaves was alive, Vincent might know something. And if he didn't, he'd know how to find out. St. Augustine's wasn't far. A 15-minute walk through streets that felt too quiet. Maybe it was the hour past midnight, too late for most and too early for the rest. Or maybe it was something else, something watching, something waiting. I ignored the feeling and kept moving. By the time I reached the church, the doors were already open. Just a crack. I frowned. Vincent didn't leave doors open. I pushed inside. The candles were still burning, but they were low. Pools of wax dripped onto the altar, hardening in jagged shapes. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of burnt wood and something else. Something metallic. Something like blood. I scanned the pews, the shadows between them stretching too long in the flickering light. Vincent. No answer. I stepped forward, my boots echoing too loud. Then, a whisper. Soft. Faint. From the confessional booth. I tensed, my fingers brushing the grip of my revolver. Vincent, that you? Nothing. I swallowed hard. Then I moved. Slow. Careful. My heart hammering like a war drum. I reached the confessional and pulled open the curtain. Vincent was inside. Slumped in the chair. His head tilted to the side, his chest rising and falling slow, unconscious. And next to him, on the seat, an envelope. I grabbed Vincent first, shaking him lightly. Vincent, a low groan. His eyelids fluttered, his body twitching like he was waking from a nightmare. I swore under my breath. His breathing was slow but steady. He was alive. Which meant someone wanted him that way. I turned to the envelope. No name, no seal. I opened it. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. A single sentence, handwritten in red ink. Felix Greaves is already looking for you. I stared. My blood went cold. I read it again. Felix wasn't just alive, he knew I was coming. And that meant someone had told him. Vincent groaned again, his body shuddering like it was trying to shake off something that had its claws in him. I crouched lower, gripping his shoulder. Come on, old man. Wake up. His eyelids flickered. Then, all at once, he jerked upright, gasping. His breathing was ragged, his pupils blown wide, like he had just crawled out of a nightmare and hadn't figured out which side was real yet. His eyes found mine, but for a moment, he didn't seem to recognize me. Then, just as quick, clarity snapped into place. His fingers curled into fists. They were here. I tightened my grip on his shoulder. Who? His lips were pale. I don't. He shut his eyes for half a second, inhaled slow. I don't know. Bullshit. Vincent always knew. I didn't press yet. I just helped him sit up straighter, letting him gather himself. His breathing slowed, but there was still something in his face. Something haunted. I lifted the note between two fingers. This was next to you. Vincent's eyes flicked to it and something deepened in his expression. Felix Greaves is alive, I said. And apparently, he's looking for me. Vincent swallowed hard. He didn't look surprised. That put a bad taste in my mouth. You knew, I said. Vincent didn't answer right away. Just exhaled, running a hand down his face. Not for sure, he muttered. Not until now. I narrowed my eyes. Tell me. He was silent for a beat. Then. They wanted me to see something, he murmured. His voice had a strange weight to it, like it was still half caught in the dream someone else had put inside his head. My skin prickled. What did you see? Vincent's jaw tensed. He licked his lips, gaze distant, as if he was still standing in the place they had shown him. Then, quietly. A house with no doors, a man with no face. And a woman who wasn't supposed to exist. The words dug into me. I knew what they meant. The hollow men, Felix Greaves, the woman in red. All pieces of the same puzzle. I clenched my jaw. Where is he, Vincent? Vincent finally looked at me, and when he spoke, I knew I wasn't going to like the answer. He's in the place that doesn't exist. Blackreach Sanitarium. Vincent's words still hung in the air. Blackreach Sanitarium. The place that didn't exist. A prison for the erased. I barely had time to let it sink in before something changed. The air in the church thickened. The candlelight flickered. Not like before, not from the wind or the weight of old ghosts, but because something else was here. Watching. Waiting. Vincent tensed, his hand twitching toward the silver flask still tucked in his coat. Monroe, he muttered, voice tight. We're not alone, I already knew. I could feel it. That slow, crawling sensation along the back of my neck. That unnatural stillness that came right before something moved. Something that shouldn't. I stood, my pulse loud in my ears, scanning the shadows stretching between the pews. There. A figure. Too still. Too quiet. Just standing. I shifted, just enough for the candlelight to catch it. Not a hollow man, not human either. Tall. Wrapped in a black coat buttoned up to the throat. Gloved hands. A wide-brimmed hat that cast most of its face in shadow. But the mouth. The mouth was smiling. Not wide, not unnatural, not the slit-thin grin of the hollow men, but wrong in a way that was almost worse. Controlled. Calculated. Like someone wearing a human expression just to see if it fit. Vincent's voice was low. You know him? No, I muttered. But he sure as hell knows me. The figure took a step forward, slow. Deliberate. The candles burned lower. Then, he spoke. Mr. Monroe. My blood ran cold. The voice was smooth, unhurried. The kind that belonged to someone who had never needed to raise it to get what they wanted. Walk away, he said. This is not your path to take. Vincent's grip tightened around his flask. I took a breath. Kept my expression blank. Yeah, I said. You here to stop me? The figure smiled wider. No. I am here to warn you. I let my fingers rest lightly against my gun. I've had plenty of warnings. He tilted his head. None like this. He took another step forward. I didn't move. Then, he reached into his coat. Vincent tensed beside me. I was ready to put 2 rounds in his chest before he got the chance to draw. But instead of a gun, he pulled out an envelope. A second one. Just like the one left beside Vincent. He extended it toward me. I didn't take it. His head tilted again, like a bird studying something small and breakable. Then, softly. "If you keep going, Mr. Monroe, you will not come back." The church lights flickered. And he was gone. Like he'd never been there at all. The only proof he had been was the envelope lying at my feet. I stared at it. So did Vincent. Neither of us moved. Then, I picked it up. The wax seal was pressed with the same symbol I'd seen on the dead man's card. The Eye of Vespara. I cracked the seal and unfolded the paper. A single line of text. "Felix Greaves has already made his choice. Will you?" The ink was red. And it was still wet. I turned the envelope over. For a second, I thought it was blank. Then, the ink shifted. Not like it was drying, not like it was smudging. Like it was bleeding. A second message was being written right in front of me. Vincent saw it too. I heard his breath hitch, his fingers twitching toward his crucifix. Then the words took shape. Not neat, not printed. This handwriting was different. Rushed, shaky, desperate. "They have me. Do not trust the priest. He is one of them." A pulse of cold ran through me. I read it again, slower. Then, I looked at Vincent. His face had gone still. His hands were loose at his sides, but his posture was all wrong. Waiting. Calculating. I swallowed. "Vincent," he exhaled. "It's a lie." My gut twisted. "Then why," I said slowly, "do you look so damn nervous?" Vincent opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the church lights flickered again. Only this time, they didn't come back on. The candles snuffed out all at once. The whole room dropped into darkness. Then, a whisper. "Close. Too close. Right behind me. You shouldn't have looked." I didn't think. Didn't hesitate. The moment the lights went out and the whisper crawled down my spine, I moved. I lunged toward the church doors, boots pounding against the floorboards. My fingers found the handle, wrenched it open. The night outside swallowed me whole. The city was silent. Not just quiet, silent. No cars. No voices. No whine through the streets. I hit the pavement hard, chest rising and falling too fast. I didn't stop. Didn't turn back. I kept moving, the silence pressing in. It wasn't right. Blackreach was never silent. Not at this hour. Not ever. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. By the time I stopped running, I was 2 blocks away. I ducked into a narrow alley between a shuttered pawn shop and a liquor store, with its neon sign buzzing like dying fireflies. Breathe. I leaned against the wall, dragging in slow lungfuls of air. The envelope was still clutched tight in my hand. The message burned behind my eyes. "Do not trust the priest." I swallowed hard. Vincent had been acting strange, sure. But did that mean he was lying? Or did it mean someone else wanted me to think he was? I clenched my jaw. Didn't matter now. I was alone. And something was hunting me. The city was too quiet. The shadows stretched too long. Then, a footstep. Slow, deliberate. Just around the corner. Someone else was here. Waiting. Watching. I tightened my grip on my revolver. My pulse pounded against my ribs. I had 2 choices. Stand my ground or run again. I stepped out of the alley. Slow. Steady. Didn't raise my gun, not yet. If they wanted me dead, they would have pulled the trigger already. This was something else. Something worse. The street was empty. Too empty. The neon sign above the liquor store still buzzed. A flickering red glow spilled across the wet pavement. But there, across the street, a figure. Standing just outside the reach of the light. I couldn't see the face. Didn't need to. I felt it. They were watching me. Waiting. I exhaled. "All right." My voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You've been following me. Now tell me why." No answer. Not right away. Then, they moved. A step forward. The neon light kissed the edge of their coat. Long, dark, expensive. The kind worn by people who didn't get their hands dirty. Except this coat was stained. At first, I thought it was the red glow from the sign. Then I saw it for what it was. Blood. I clenched my jaw. "That yours?" A pause. Then, a voice. Low. Smooth. Familiar. Not mine. My stomach twisted. Because I knew that voice. Knew it down to the bones. And the moment the figure stepped into the light, I felt my whole body go cold. It was Felix Greaves. Alive. And smiling. Felix Greaves was supposed to be dead. 6 years in the ground. 6 years wiped from existence. And yet, here he was. Standing across from me in a bloodstained coat, looking like he hadn't missed a single goddamn day. I clenched my jaw. "You're supposed to be dead." Felix grinned. "So are a lot of people, Monroe." His voice hadn't changed. Smooth, unhurried. Like he was in on a joke no one else could hear. My grip on my revolver tightened. You mind explaining how a man burns to death and walks away smiling? Felix tilted his head. Would it make you feel better if I said I never really left? I exhaled slow, my pulse hammering. Where the hell have you been, Felix? He smirked. Would you believe me if I said I was in hell? I didn't smile. Try me. Felix stepped closer, his boots clicking against the wet pavement. He moved like someone who didn't have to be afraid anymore. Like someone who'd already seen the worst there was. And walked out the other side. I know what you're looking for, he said. My stomach twisted. He meant her. The woman in red. Where is she? I asked. Felix studied me. His grin faded just slightly, like he was deciding how much to say. Then, finally, he spoke. Not where. When. A slow chill spread through my ribs. I swallowed. What the hell does that mean? Felix's lips parted. But before he could answer, a voice from behind me. You shouldn't be talking to him, Monroe. I turned fast, gun raised. Vincent. Standing at the mouth of the alley, half shrouded in the dark, his face was unreadable, but his gun was pointed at Felix. Felix just sighed. He muttered, here we go. Vincent didn't lower his gun. Not even a fraction. His grip was steady, his expression blank. Too blank. I'd seen that look before. On killers. On men who pull the trigger without a second thought. And right now, he was looking at Felix Greaves like he was something that needed to be put down. He's not what you think he is, Monroe. My pulse kicked up. Felix sighed, like he'd been expecting this. His hand stayed loose at his sides, but his grin had faded. Come on, Vincent, he muttered. We both know this isn't the way to play it. Vincent didn't move. Didn't blink. Step away from him, Monroe. I didn't. I kept my gun trained between them. Somebody start talking, I said. Now. Felix exhaled, rolling his shoulders. All right. Let's start simple. How do you kill a man that doesn't exist? I didn't answer. Vincent did. You make sure he stays forgotten. Felix grinned, sharp. Exactly. Then he turned his gaze back to me. And, Monroe. His voice was soft. Almost kind. You're next. The street felt too quiet. The neon glow buzzed against the rain-slick pavement, washing everything in blood-red light. Vincent didn't waver. You let him talk, and you're as good as dead. His voice was cold. Or worse, Felix smirked. Now there's a fun idea. I clenched my jaw. Everything in me was screaming to choose. But both of them had guns. Both of them had secrets. And I had 1 second to decide who I trusted more. I didn't lower my gun. Didn't side with either of them. Didn't move. Because there was only one thing I needed to know. I exhaled slow. My voice was steady when I spoke. Who took her? Silence. Felix tilted his head, watching me close, but he didn't smile this time. Vincent's grip on his gun didn't waver. But something in his expression shifted. They weren't expecting that. Good. I took a step forward, keeping my gun between them. You both know, I said. So tell me. Felix clicked his tongue. Smart man. Vincent's jaw tightened. Monroe. Felix cut him off. I'll tell you, detective. He took a slow step forward. I didn't stop him. His voice was quiet. Measured. She was taken by something older than the hollow men. The word settled deep. A cold pulse ran down my spine. Felix watched me carefully. Something worse. Vincent exhaled sharply. Don't listen to him. I turned on him. Then you tell me, Vincent, who took her? Vincent hesitated. Just for a second. That was enough. Felix grinned. See that? He muttered. That's the problem with liars, Monroe. They never answered the right questions. I stared at Vincent. Who took her? I repeated. Vincent's grip on the gun tightened. Then, he exhaled. And finally, he told me. The ones who built the hollow men. The words hit harder than a bullet. I felt my pulse low. Like the world had just gotten darker. Felix smirked. Now we're getting somewhere. I swallowed hard. Who the hell are they? Vincent's voice was low, steady. Like he was finally saying something he never wanted to say. The architects. Felix laughed. Not his usual smirk, not the sharp knowing grin of a man who always had the upper hand. This laugh was different, soft, amused. Dangerous. I didn't like it. Felix shook his head, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his blood-stained coat. Oh, Monroe. His voice was too calm. Too resigned. You were never supposed to hear that name. I clenched my jaw. Yeah, then why say it? Felix stopped smiling, his shoulders squared. His gaze sharpened. And in that moment, I realized something. Felix wasn't afraid of Vincent. Felix wasn't afraid of the hollow men. Felix wasn't afraid of me. But he was afraid of them. The architects, whoever they were. A slow, cold weight settled in my gut. Vincent saw it too. He stepped toward me, voice tight. "We need to go. Now." Felix scoffed. "Oh, sure. Like running's gonna help." I frowned. Felix turned toward me, tilting his head like he was considering something. Then his expression darkened. "Listen to me, detective." His voice was lower now. Measured. The voice of a man who had already seen the ending. "You can leave. You can forget. You can walk away right now and live just a little while longer." I swallowed hard. Or. Felix exhaled. The neon light above us flickered. Then, the world changed. A sound rolled through the city. Not a voice. Not a whisper. Something deeper. Something beneath the streets. Like the bones of Blackreach were shifting. Felix shut his eyes. Then he muttered, barely above a whisper. "And that's them hearing their name." Vincent grabbed my arm. Hard. His voice was sharp. Urgent. "Move, Monroe. Now." Vincent's fingers dug into my arm. I didn't fight him. Didn't hesitate. I ran. Felix didn't follow. I barely caught a glimpse of him as I turned, still standing in the flickering red glow of the neon, hands in his coat pockets, watching. Like a man waiting for the storm to hit. But I wasn't waiting. Neither was Vincent. We moved fast, cutting through the alleys, boots slamming against wet pavement. The air smelled different. The neon signs hummed too loud. Vincent was muttering something under his breath. Prayers, maybe. Curses, more likely. Then, finally, he spoke. "Where?" I knew what he meant. We couldn't run forever. We needed somewhere to go. And I knew just the place. The Blue Orchid. Vincent shot me a look but didn't argue. By the time we reached it, my lungs were burning. The bouncer at the door barely had time to size me up before I shoved past him. Vincent was 2 steps behind. Inside, the air was thick with perfume, cigarette smoke, and the quiet hum of danger. The Blue Orchid wasn't just a bar. It was a negotiation table, a place where the rich, the powerful, and the dangerous came to make the kind of deals that didn't belong on paper. And it was the only place I knew the architects wouldn't touch. Not yet. Because if the eye of this bar was dealing with the hollow men, that meant they were afraid of something, too. And that meant they knew more than they were letting on. Vincent was breathing hard, his fingers twitching near his coat pocket. Where he kept the flask. He didn't like being here. Didn't trust these people. But I wasn't here for the eye. I was here for Harper Vale. And the moment I spotted her, draped in emerald silk, perched in a corner booth like a queen waiting for her audience, I knew one thing for certain. She had answers. And I was about to get them. Harper Vale didn't do surprises. She expected people to come crawling to her. And the look she gave me, cool, amused, sharp as a scalpel, told me she knew I would be here before I did. She sipped her drink, red lips curling at the rim of the glass, emerald silk draped over her legs like spilled ink. "You look like hell, Monroe," she purred. "Running from something." I didn't sit. Didn't answer. I was still catching my breath, still feeling the city breathing behind me. The weight of whatever had just woken up in Blackreach was pressing against my ribs like a second heartbeat. Vincent hovered beside me, tense. He didn't like this place, didn't trust her. Didn't trust me for bringing us here. I ignored him. Harper smiled, slow and deliberate, like she was enjoying herself. "No drink," she teased. "You usually take whiskey. No ice. Unless it's one of those nights where you forget what you are, and then you drink like a man with nothing left to lose." I leaned forward, planting my hands on the edge of the table. "I need information." She tilted her head. "About what?" I held her gaze. "The architects." Her smile didn't fade. But something in her changed. Her grip tightened ever so slightly around her glass. Her pupils dilated, barely noticeable, but I caught it. Harper Vale was many things. Afraid wasn't usually one of them. But right now, she was afraid. She recovered quick. Laughed lightly, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. "Now why would you go asking about people who don't exist?" I leaned in. "Because one of them took her." Harper's smirk twitched. "Ah. The woman in red." Vincent stiffened. I didn't move. "You know about her," I said. She exhaled through her nose, setting her drink down. "Everyone in the right circles knows about her, Monroe. The question is, why do you still remember her?" My stomach turned. She knew. Knew about the hollow men. Knew about what they did. And she knew I wasn't supposed to remember. Harper's gaze flicked to Vincent. "And you brought the priest." She shook her head, sighing like I was a child who'd wandered into traffic. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" I sat down slow. "Tell me what you know." She watched me. For a long, stretched out second, she considered her next move. Then, Harper Vale did something she never did. She leaned in. And for the first time since I met her, she didn't sound amused. She sounded dead serious. The architects don't just erase people, Monroe. Her voice was softer now. Lower. They rewrite them. The ice in my glass melted. So did the pit in my stomach, because I knew what she meant. The woman in red wasn't just taken, she was becoming someone else. Vincent's voice was cold. You really gonna believe her? I barely looked at him. She hasn't lied yet. She hasn't told the truth either. I exhaled, rubbing the bridge of my nose. I was too goddamn tired for this. For games, for riddles, for half-truths wrapped in silk and cigarettes. I turned back to Harper. He thinks you're leading me into a trap, Harper smirked. That's because he's used to seeing the world in absolutes, good and evil, sinners and saints. But that's not how this works, is it? Vincent's jaw clenched. His fingers twitched toward his flask, like he was debating whether to take a drink or throw it at her. I sat back in my chair. Then tell me how it works. Harper's smile faded. Her green eyes gleamed sharp in the dim light, calculating. The architects don't just erase people, Monroe, she said again. They repurpose them. Vincent exhaled sharply through his nose. And you expect him to believe that? Harper turned to him. I expect him to believe that your precious God isn't the only one who plays with souls. That shut him up. For a second, at least, she turned back to me. You're chasing a ghost. And even if you find her, she won't be who you think she is anymore. I clenched my jaw. She's still in there. Harper watched me. Carefully. Then, slowly, she nodded. Maybe. Vincent scoffed, shaking his head. And what do you get out of this, Harper? She smiled. A slow, knowing smile. I want to see what happens next. She reached for her drink again, took a slow sip, then placed it back down. Then, she folded her hands over the table and said, very simply, I can get you inside. Silence. Vincent's fingers curled into fists. I swallowed. Inside where? Harper leaned forward. The place where they keep the ones who haven't been rewritten yet. The word settled deep in my ribs. Vincent shook his head. No. No, you don't know what you're saying. Harper ignored him. Her gaze was locked onto mine, unblinking. Blackreach Sanitarium, Monroe. My stomach tightened. Harper smiled. That's where she is. Harper Vale never gave anything for free. Not information. Not favors. And sure as hell not a way into Blackreach Sanitarium. She tilted her head, watching me like a cat watching a dying bird. I'll help you, detective, but you owe me. Vincent stiffened beside me. Monroe. Don't. I didn't look at him. Didn't blink, because I already knew what my answer was. What's the price? Harper smiled. And that scared me more than anything else in this goddamn city. She swirled the last of her drink, watching the amber liquid move like it held secrets of its own. Then, she exhaled slow, setting the glass down. Nothing yet, she said. I frowned. That's not how you work. Her gaze flicked up, locking onto mine. No, she admitted, but this is different. I swallowed. How different? She leaned in. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Because if you walk through that door, you won't be the same man when you walk back out. I clenched my jaw. I'll take my chances. Harper studied me. Then, slowly, she smiled. Good answer. She reached inside her silk coat, pulling out a small black envelope, the kind of thing that only went to the right kind of people. She slid it across the table. Tomorrow night, 11:45, sharp. One night only. I took the envelope, turning it over in my fingers. No writing. No seal. Just heavy, black paper. I flicked my gaze back to her. What's inside? Harper smiled again. An invitation. Vincent let out a slow breath. You're making a mistake. Harper didn't even look at him. He's making history. I felt it before I saw it. That slow, crawling sensation along the back of my neck, the unmistakable weight of being watched. Someone who had followed me here. Someone who had been listening. The weight of the black envelope was still in my hand, its edges sharp against my fingertips. I didn't turn my head right away. Didn't let them know I had noticed. Instead, I exhaled slow. Set the envelope down on the table. Harper smirked. Something wrong, detective. I ignored her. Kept my eyes on the darkened window at the far end of the bar. The Blue Orchid was a high-class joint, low lights, velvet curtains, booths wrapped in shadows where people whispered about things that shouldn't exist. And in one of those shadows, a figure. Just barely visible. Sitting alone, not drinking. Not talking. Just watching. I tensed. They weren't dressed like the Eye of Vespara. No expensive suits, no rings, no veiled arrogance. And they weren't dressed like the Hollow Men, either. This was different. Worse, because I recognized the coat. Long, dark, buttoned up to the throat. The same coat worn by the man who gave me the first black envelope. I swallowed. Harper followed my gaze. And for the first time since I'd walked in, her smirk faltered. Not much. Just a flicker, a fraction of a second. But it was enough. She didn't know who they were, either. Vincent shifted beside me. We need to go. I agreed. Didn't mean I was leaving just yet. I reached for my drink. Took a slow sip. Then, without breaking eye contact, I slid out of my chair and walked toward them. Harper didn't stop me. Vincent muttered a curse but followed. The closer I got, the clearer the figure became. Male, mid-40s, scar along the cheekbone, like something had once tried to carve him open. But it wasn't the scar that set me on edge, it was his eyes. Wide. Too wide. Like he was seeing something that wasn't there. I stopped at his table. Didn't sit. Didn't look away. Enjoying the show. The man smiled, a slow, lazy curl of the lips, too casual. Too knowing. Then, he spoke. Do you remember your own name, detective? The question hit me like a bullet. The air shifted. Vincent tensed. Harper went completely still. And I felt a cold hand close around my spine. Because he didn't ask it like he was guessing. He asked it like he already knew the answer. Or worse, like he knew I wouldn't. I didn't flinch. Didn't look away. Didn't let him see the way his words dug under my skin like old nails. Instead, I answered. Monroe. The man tilted his head. That wrong smile didn't fade. But he said nothing. And that was worse. Vincent exhaled sharply through his nose. I could feel the tension rolling off him in waves. His hand hovered near his coat. Near his flask. Not a good sign. Harper didn't move. She just watched, lips pressed together, like someone who already knew what was coming next. The man leaned forward. His gloved fingers tapped against the table. Slow. Deliberate. Do you believe that? He asked softly. The question slithered up my spine. A pulse of cold settled behind my ribs. Yeah, I muttered. I believe that. The man's fingers drummed once. Twice. Then, he laughed. A short, quiet chuckle, like he was letting me in on some private joke. You shouldn't, he murmured. The room went still. Vincent stiffened beside me. I could see his muscles coiled tight, ready for something I couldn't see yet. Harper let out a slow breath through her nose. Like a woman watching a train wreck in slow motion. I swallowed. And then, the man slid something across the table. A photograph. Black and white. Old. I hesitated. Then, I picked it up. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. A man in a suit. Standing in a dimly lit office. Cigarette in hand. A case file on the desk. Then, my stomach dropped, because I was looking at myself, but the date scrawled in the bottom corner. 1947. My fingers felt stiff as I turned the photograph over. There was writing on the back. My handwriting. Sharp, hurried strokes of ink. Like I had written it in a rush. Like I had written it knowing I wouldn't remember. I swallowed hard and read the words. This isn't the first time. My grip tightened. I read it again. And again. But the words didn't change. Didn't shift, didn't bleed, didn't vanish like some hallucination clawing at the edge of my mind. No. This was real. Vincent muttered a curse under his breath. Harper reached for her cigarette case, flipping it open with calm, practiced fingers. But I caught the way she inhaled a little sharper than usual. And the man across from me, he just sat there. Watching. Waiting. Like he had seen this play out before. I clenched my jaw. What the hell is this? The man tilted his head. Proof. I exhaled slow, my pulse thick in my throat. Of what? The man's smile stretched just a little wider. That you've already lost. A flicker of something cold buried itself under my skin. I looked at Vincent. He was staring at the photo. At me. Like he was seeing something he didn't want to. Vincent, I muttered. Say something. He didn't. Not right away. Then, finally, his voice dropped to something close to a whisper. What do you remember about last year, Monroe? I blinked. Frowned. What? Vincent's expression darkened. Last year. What do you remember? The cold sank deeper. I opened my mouth, then stopped, because nothing came. No cases. No faces. No bad nights or whiskey-soaked mornings. Nothing. Just a blank space where an entire year should be. I felt the weight of the photo like it was made of lead. Harper exhaled, cigarette smoke curling between her fingers. You're catching up, detective. I forced myself to swallow. I turned back to the man. He was still watching me. Still smiling. I needed to ask something. Anything. But before I could, the lights flickered. Not like before. Not like a power surge or a broken circuit. Like something was stepping into the room. Like something was watching. And waiting. Just like him. Then, he stood. The man in the long coat. The man with the too wide smile and the voice that knew things I shouldn't have forgotten. And in the flickering glow of the blue orchid chandeliers, his face didn't look like a face at all. My grip on the photograph tightened. Because for a split second, I saw the truth. His features weren't just wrong, they were unfinished. Like someone had started painting him but never finished the details. Like he wasn't supposed to be seen this close. My pulse hammered. The lights flickered again. And for half a second, there was nothing under his skin. Just darkness, deep, endless. Like looking into the space where a person was supposed to be and finding nothing but an empty outline. Vincent grabbed my arm, hard. We need to go. Now. I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Because the man, the thing in front of me, was still watching. Still smiling. And this time, when he spoke, his voice was wrong. Not deep. Not smooth. Just hollow. You're remembering too much, Monroe. The whole bar went silent. Harper stiffened. Her hand curled around the edge of the table, cigarette forgotten between her fingers. I finally found my voice. Who are you? The smile stretched a little wider. That's not the right question. The air around me felt too thin. My lungs fought to pull in breath. I swallowed hard. Then what is? The thing in front of me leaned in, his hollow eyes locked onto mine. And then, he whispered. Who do you think you are? The lights died. Everything went black. And I fell. Darkness. Thick, suffocating, absolute. Not just the absence of light. Something deeper. Like the air had been stripped away, like the city itself had been peeled back to reveal the hollow space underneath. I was falling. Or maybe I wasn't. Maybe I was being pulled. Then, a voice. Sharp. Urgent. Familiar. Stay with me, Monroe. I tried to move. Nothing. My fingers felt distant, like they weren't mine. My lungs fought to pull in breath, but there was nothing to breathe. Vincent's voice cut through the dark again. Don't let them take you. Something cold curled around my limbs. Not hands. Not ropes. Just weight. Like the dark itself was pressing down on me, like it wanted to drag me somewhere I couldn't come back from. I fought against it, but the more I struggled, the deeper it pulled. Then, something else. A second voice. Soft. Familiar. A woman's voice. You don't belong here. A pulse of warmth shot through my chest. Not much. Just enough. My fingers twitched. Monroe. Vincent again. Closer. Angrier. Like he was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping through his fingers. I clenched my jaw. Forced my body to move. A breath. A twitch. A single inch forward. The dark fought me, but it hesitated. And that was all I needed. I pushed harder. Then, light. Blinding. Brutal. Like stepping out of a nightmare and into something worse. The weight vanished. I hit the ground hard, coughing, gasping, my lungs drinking in the air like I'd been drowning. Vincent was kneeling beside me, his grip tight on my shoulder. His face was pale, his jaw set in something that looked dangerously close to fear. You almost didn't make it. I swallowed hard, blinking up at the ceiling. We were still in the blue orchid. The chandeliers were swaying. The air was thick with smoke and something metallic. The bar was empty. No patrons, no whispers, no music, and no sign of him. The man in the coat. The thing with the unfinished face. Harper was standing a few feet away, staring at me like I was something she wasn't sure was real anymore. I pushed myself up, still catching my breath. What the hell just happened? Vincent exhaled. Then, quietly, you almost got rewritten. Harper stared at me. Not her usual smirk. Not that amused glint in her eyes when she thought she was 2 steps ahead. No. This was different. This was uncertainty. She took a slow drag from her cigarette. Exhaled. Then, finally. You just met one of them, detective. Her voice was calm. Measured. But underneath it. Something close to awe. And you're still here. Vincent scoffed. Barely. Harper ignored him. She tilted her head, watching me like I was a riddle she hadn't figured out yet. That's new. I swallowed, my throat still raw. My fingers twitched, my body still adjusting to the fact that I was back in it, back in reality. I licked my lips. One of who? Harper let the question hang in the air. Then, quietly. An architect. The word hit like a hammer. Vincent muttered a curse, dragging a hand down his face. I didn't blink. Didn't breathe. Because now, I had seen one. And I knew they weren't just stories. I clenched my jaw. They tried to rewrite me. Harper exhaled, flicking ash from her cigarette. They almost did. The room felt smaller. The air thicker. I forced myself to breathe slow. Even. Keep my head. What stopped them? Vincent frowned. Harper studied me. Neither answered. Because none of us knew. Harper tapped ash from her cigarette, watching me like I was a game piece that had just moved in a way she hadn't expected. She took her time, exhaled slow. Then, she smiled. But it wasn't amusement. It was understanding. And that scared me more than anything else. "All right, detective," she murmured. "Here's where we stand." Vincent tensed beside me. He already didn't like where this was going. Harper leaned in. The smoke from her cigarette curled between us. "You can keep digging, Monroe," she said. "But now. They're looking at you, too." I swallowed. "Then I'll dig faster." Harper's lips curled. "That's what I like about you." Vincent cursed under his breath. "Monroe. Think about this." "I already have." Vincent shook his head. "No. You haven't." His fingers twitched toward his flask, a habit, a warning, or both. "You're not dealing with the Eye of Vespar anymore. You're not dealing with the Hollow Men. You're dealing with the people who built them." Harper smirked. "And that's why he needs to move now." Vincent glared at her. "You don't care what happens to him." She exhaled through her nose. "You do. And yet, here we are." Vincent's jaw clenched. I watched them both. I wasn't blind. I knew the weight of the choice sitting in my lap. But I also knew this. The woman in red was still out there. And if I stopped now, she never existed. I turned back to Harper. "You said you could get me into Blackreach Sanitarium." She nodded once. I exhaled slow. "Then let's do it." Harper grinned. Vincent swore. And just like that. There was no turning back. Harper Vale smirked. But not like before. Not that sharp, amused curl of the lips when she thought she had me wrapped around her little finger. This was colder. Because we both knew what was coming next. And she wasn't bluffing. "You don't walk into Blackreach Sanitarium, detective," she murmured. "You get admitted." Vincent stilled. His hand twitched toward my wrist. Not to stop me. To warn me. "Monroe," he muttered. "This is a bad idea." I didn't look at him. Didn't blink. Because Harper was still watching me. Waiting. Testing. "How?" I asked. Harper smiled slow, dragging her cigarette to her lips. "They only take a certain kind of patient," she said. "The type nobody asks questions about." I clenched my jaw. "And what type is that?" She exhaled a slow plume of smoke, tilting her head like I was something she was considering buying at auction. "People who don't exist." The word settled in my chest like a second heartbeat. I swallowed. "And how do I convince them I don't?" Harper reached into her coat. Pulled out a small vial of something dark and glassy. She set it on the table. "Drink this," she murmured. Vincent cursed. "Jesus Christ, Harper." She didn't even glance at him. She just nudged the vial forward with one perfectly manicured finger. Then, she smiled. "Say goodbye to yourself, detective." Harper smirked. "You could drink it yourself, detective," she murmured, tapping the vial with one delicate fingernail. "Or, you could let me handle it." Vincent tensed beside me. His hand twitched toward my wrist again, like he could feel the choice slipping through his fingers. I stared at the vial. Dark. Thick. Not quite liquid, not quite smoke. It didn't just sit still inside the glass, it moved. I exhaled. "What does it do?" Harper's eyes gleamed in the low light. "It erases you." My pulse kicked up. Vincent swore. "Harper." She ignored him. "Not permanently, of course," she continued smoothly, leaning back in her chair. "That's not my game. But long enough to get you inside." I clenched my jaw. "And what happens to me while I'm gone?" Harper smiled. "That depends." Vincent's voice was low. Tense. "If you let her do this," he muttered, "you don't come back as the same man." That hit somewhere deep. I swallowed hard. "And if I don't do it?" Harper shrugged, reaching for her cigarette. "Then you'll never find her." I glanced at Vincent. His jaw was tight, his fingers curled into a fist like he was trying not to punch something. I looked back at Harper. "What's the catch?" She exhaled a slow curl of smoke. "I choose what they see." I frowned. "Meaning?" Harper leaned in, voice soft, almost kind. "Meaning, detective," she murmured, "that when they look at you, they won't see John Monroe." My breath hitched. Harper tilted her head. "They'll see whoever I tell them to see." I clenched my jaw. "For how long?" She smiled. "Long enough." Vincent exhaled sharply through his nose. "And when he's inside," Harper waved a lazy hand. "Then, he just has to make sure they don't decide to keep him." I swallowed hard. Because that was the part I wasn't sure I could control. I didn't hesitate, didn't look at Vincent. Didn't give myself time to think, because thinking would make me hesitate. And if I hesitated, I might never find her. I grabbed the vial. "Do it." Vincent swore. "Monroe." But Harper just smiled. Slow. Amused. Like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. Like she already knew how the game was going to end. She flicked her cigarette into the ashtray, sat up a little straighter, and laced her fingers together on the table. Good choice. I swallowed hard. How does this work? She exhaled through her nose. Simple. Then she tilted her head. And said the words that would change everything. I decide what the architects see when they look at you. A slow, creeping sensation curled around my spine. I licked my lips. And who am I supposed to be? Harper smiled. Whoever I need you to be, detective. The air felt heavy. Vincent stiffened beside me. Monroe, think. But it was too late. Harper lifted her hand. Snapped her fingers. And then, everything changed. It wasn't pain. Not exactly. More like a tearing. Like something was peeling away my reflection. Like I was still inside my body, but my body wasn't mine anymore. I gasped. My fingers tingled. My vision blurred. The blue orchid flickered, shifting at the edges, like I was seeing two versions of the same world at once. I looked down at my hands. And they weren't my hands. My breath caught. They were too pale. The fingers longer, thinner. The veins too sharp beneath the skin. I clenched my jaw, forced myself to breathe. Harper, I rasped. What the hell? She leaned forward, resting her chin on one hand. Don't panic, she murmured. You're still in there. For now. My pulse hammered against my ribs. For now. Vincent's voice was tight. What did you do to him? Harper exhaled. I made sure they'd recognize him, she said simply. The words made my stomach turn. I swallowed. Recognize me as who? Harper's smile was slow. Amused. Knowing. Then, she slid a small, round mirror across the table. My breath hitched. I picked it up. And when I saw the face staring back at me, I stopped breathing, because it wasn't mine, it was Felix Greaves. I gripped the edge of the table. My reflection in the mirror watched with wide, unfamiliar eyes. I still felt like myself. But I didn't look like myself. My pulse hammered, my stomach twisting into something sharp and sick. Harper smirked. Now, let's get you admitted, shall we? Like this was just another business deal. Like she hadn't just rewritten me. Vincent cursed under his breath. Monroe, you don't have to do this. Yeah, I muttered, setting the mirror down. Then how do I find her? Silence. Vincent clenched his jaw. Harper exhaled, tapping a fingernail against the table. He's already made his choice, priest. Vincent's glare could have peeled paint. So have you. Harper's lips curled. I always make the winning one. I didn't have time for their games. I turned back to Harper. What's the plan? Her smirk widened. She slipped a small folded paper out of her coat and slid it across the table. A patient intake form. Felix Greaves, male, admitted for paranoid delusions. I swallowed hard. They think Felix is already inside. Harper nodded. And now? So are you. I exhaled slow. And once I'm in, Harper's green eyes gleamed in the low light. You find the woman in red. Vincent scoffed. If she's still her. The words landed like a blow. I clenched my jaw. She's still her. She had to be. Harper stood, adjusting the silk of her coat. You'll be taken in the morning, she said lightly, like we were planning a goddamn brunch. No visitors. No calls. You go in, you stay in. That's how it works. I nodded. And you? Harper smirked. I'll make sure you don't disappear completely. I exhaled, pressing my fingers into the table. I was doing this. By sunrise, I wouldn't be John Monroe anymore. I would be Felix Greaves. And I would be inside Blackreach Sanitarium. Where they kept the ones they erased. I didn't sleep. Not really. I tried. But every time I closed my eyes, I felt it. That weight. That creeping sensation at the edges of my mind, like something was watching. Or worse, like something was waiting. I laid on the bed, staring at the ceiling of my apartment, feeling the borrowed skin of Felix Greaves stretch over me like a second shadow. I still felt like myself. But for how long? I exhaled slow, rubbing a hand over my face. Then, a voice. Soft, familiar. Right by my ear. Don't forget who you are, detective. I froze. My pulse spiked, my breath catching in my throat. I turned my head. The room was empty. But I knew that voice. It was hers, the woman in red. She was still in there. And she was still fighting. I clenched my jaw. Swallowed hard. She remembered me. That meant I could still find her. But I was running out of time, because by sunrise, I wouldn't be John Monroe anymore. I sat up fast, heart hammering. The room was still dark, still empty. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something in the air, pressing against my skin. Not like a presence, not like something physical. Worse, like something inside my own head. Then, a whisper. Softer. Closer. Who are you? The hairs on my arms rose. I swallowed hard. My throat was dry, my pulse slamming against my ribs. The voice was hers. But different. Quieter. Uncertain. Like she wasn't just speaking to me. Like she was asking herself. I clenched my fists, forced myself to breathe slow. Who are you? It came again, curling through the dark. I swallowed, opened my mouth, and answered. John Monroe. Silence, then, a quiet laugh. Not cruel. Not mocking. Just, sad. Not anymore. My stomach turned cold. The room felt wrong. Like I was sitting in a place I had already left behind. I ran a hand down my face, trying to steady my breathing. Trying to hold on to myself, but the voice wasn't done. Find me before you forget. Then, silence. The air lightened, the weight vanished, but the words stayed, because she wasn't just warning me. She was pleading. The room was silent. The kind of silence that didn't feel empty, the kind that felt full. Like the walls were listening. Like the air was waiting. I exhaled slow, my breath shaking just enough to piss me off. Then, the whisper came again. Soft. Closer than before. Monroe. I swallowed hard. The voice still sounded like hers, but something was different. Something was off. Before, she had spoken to me. Warned me, pleaded. This time, she was uncertain. Like she wasn't sure if she was talking to the right person. I clenched my jaw. I'm here. Silence. Then. No, you're not. My pulse slammed. The room tilted. And before I could say anything else, she spoke again. The whisper crawled into my ears. Soft, slow, deliberate. And she called me by a name I had never heard before. A name that wasn't mine, but I knew it. Somewhere, deep in the hollow spaces of my mind. I knew it. And the moment I heard it, my vision blurred. The air thinned. The world lurched. And then, a knock at the door. Sharp. Loud. I sucked in a breath, the moment shattering. The whisper was gone, but the feeling in my chest. That stayed. Another knock. Then, Vincent's voice. Monroe, open the door. I swallowed hard. The whisper was gone. The name I wasn't supposed to know was still curling inside my skull, but the world around me felt stable again. For now. Another knock, harder this time. Vincent's voice, sharp. Monroe. Open the damn door. I exhaled, ran a hand down my face, and forced myself to move. The floor felt solid under my feet. My body felt real, but something was still off. Like I'd stepped out of sync with reality for just a second, just long enough for something else to notice. I unlocked the door. Vincent stepped in fast, pushing past me, eyes sweeping the room. He was on edge, more than usual. He turned back to me, jaw tight. You alright? I frowned. I'm fine. It wasn't a lie. Not really. Vincent didn't look convinced. His gaze flicked to the bedside table, where the black envelope still sat. Then to the mirror. Then, back to me. You don't look fine, he muttered. I crossed my arms. You here to talk me out of this again? Vincent didn't answer right away. He hesitated. That's what got me. Not the usual lecture, not the muttered curses about how I was an idiot walking straight into a grave, just hesitation. Then, finally, you heard something, didn't you? My stomach turned. I met his gaze. What do you know? Vincent exhaled slow. His fingers twitched near his coat. Not toward his gun. Toward the flask. Like he was considering whether he needed a drink before he said it. Then, he spoke. And what he said changed everything. Vincent's fingers twitched near his flask. He exhaled slow. Then, he looked me dead in the eye. That name you heard. His voice was low. Measured. Like he was saying something that shouldn't be said. It's not the first time you've heard it. The air went thin. Something inside me lurched. What the hell does that mean? Vincent studied me. Carefully. Then, he reached into his coat, pulled out something small, folded. Worn with time. A photograph. He held it out. Didn't say a word. I took it. Turned it over. And the second I saw what was on it, I forgot how to breathe. It was a picture of me. Standing outside a building. A tall iron-gated asylum. Blackreach Sanitarium. The edges of the photo were curled. The ink faded. But the date printed at the bottom. 1947. My pulse slammed. The same year that was on the last photo. The one the architect gave me. Vincent's voice was quiet. You've done this before, Monroe. I clenched my jaw. That's not possible. Vincent didn't blink. Then tell me why you're in that picture. I forced myself to breathe. To think. The whispers. The name. The missing time. The architects don't just erase people. They rewrite them. I looked back down at the photo. And at the very bottom, written in ink, handwriting that looked an awful lot like mine. Find me before they change me again. I took a slow breath. I didn't want to ask. Didn't want to hear it, because deep down, some part of me already knew. But I had to. So I met Vincent's gaze. And I asked a question that would change everything. Then what did I say, Vincent? Silence. His fingers twitched at his side, like he was considering lying. Like he wanted to. But he didn't. Instead, he exhaled slow. And he told me. James Holloway. The room tilted. Because the second I heard it, it fit. Like a lock clicking into place. Like a door opening inside my mind that had been sealed shut for a long, long time. The whisper came back. Not her voice. Mine. Find me before they change me again. A sharp splitting pain tore through my skull. I staggered back, pressing a palm to my temple, heart slamming. Vincent grabbed my arm, steadying me. Easy, Monroe. I ripped away from him. Because for the first time, I wasn't sure if Monroe was even my name anymore. James Holloway. The name sat in my chest like a second heartbeat. A name I had never heard before. A name I had already spoken once. And worst of all, a name that felt like mine. My skull ached. The name still rattled inside me, pressing against something fragile, something barely holding together. James Holloway. And Vincent, he knew it before I did. I exhaled slow, shoving the pain down. Gritted my teeth. Forced my voice steady. How the hell do you know that name, Vincent? Vincent didn't answer right away. Didn't look at me, either. He just ran a hand down his face, exhaled sharp through his nose, like he was debating how much trouble it'd be to lie to me again. I took a step forward. Don't make me ask again. Vincent finally looked at me. And the look in his eyes, it wasn't anger. It wasn't guilt. It was pity. Because it's not the first time you've asked me that, he muttered. The floor felt unsteady. Like the whole world had tilted just slightly. I swallowed. What? Vincent sighed. Then, he pulled something from his coat. A second photograph. And when he handed it to me, I already knew what I was about to see. But nothing could have prepared me for how wrong it felt. It was me. Not just me, a different me. Same eyes, same expression. But different clothes, different haircut. And at the bottom, the name written in ink. Not Monroe. James Holloway. My stomach turned. Vincent ran a hand through his hair, looking tired. You've been chazzing her, Monroe, he exhaled. But maybe, you should have been chazzing yourself. I lifted my gaze, pinning him in place. How long have you known? Vincent exhaled through his nose. Didn't flinch. Didn't answer right away, either. Which meant he was choosing his words. I hated that. How long, Vincent? My voice was tight. Dangerous. Because if he'd been keeping this from me, that meant he wasn't just an ally. He was part of the goddamn story. Vincent rolled his shoulders. Finally met my gaze. A while. The floor tilted. How long is a while? Vincent sighed, rubbing his temple. Since the first time you came to me for help. I stared. My throat went dry. Because that was years ago. Before I left the force. Before I walked into the mess with the hollow men. Before I started looking for her. You're saying, my voice felt distant. You're saying I was already rewritten. Vincent exhaled slow. Not exactly. Then what? Vincent hesitated. Just for a second. Then, you weren't erased, Monroe. His voice was low. Careful. You were changed. I froze. Something deep inside me cracked. Like an old door unlocking. Like a memory shoving its way to the surface. James Holloway. That name wasn't just a ghost, it was a foundation. And someone, something, had built John Monroe on top of it. I didn't speak. Didn't move. Because the second Vincent said it, the second he told me I was changed, not erased, something shifted. Not in the room. Not in the air. In reality itself, a feeling crawled down my spine. The kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched. Vincent saw the look in my eyes. His shoulders tensed. Monroe, he muttered. What is it? And then, the room dimmed. Not the light. The world. Like something was closing in. Like something had just remembered me. A cold electric shudder raced up my arms, coiling in my skull, pressing against something buried. Something I had been meant to forget. I staggered back. Pressed a palm against my temple. Vincent grabbed my arm. Monroe. I sucked in a breath, but it wasn't enough. The world blurred. And for half a second, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was somewhere else. A corridor. Fluorescent lights. A dull humming noise. A door. A locked door. And my name. Not Monroe. Holloway. Written on the door in red ink. Not ink. Blood. Then, a whisper. Time's up. And just like that, the vision snapped. I gasped, shoving back into reality, into my body, into the weight of the present. Vincent was shaking me. Monroe. I blinked hard. The world sharpened. I was back. But the feeling was still there. Something had just noticed me. Something that wasn't supposed to. I wasn't sure I could hide anymore. A knock, sharp, hard. Like someone knew exactly what had just happened. I locked eyes with Vincent. Neither of us moved. Neither of us breathed. Then, a second knock. Louder. I swallowed, forcing my body to stay steady. Forcing my mind to hold on to what I had just seen. A corridor. A locked door. My name, written in blood. James Holloway. That wasn't just a memory. It was a warning. Vincent shifted, his hand already drifting toward his gun, expecting company. I shook my head. Then we have a problem. No shit. My fingers twitched near my own revolver. I exhaled slow. Moved toward the door. Vincent tensed. Monroe. I ignored him. Whoever was on the other side knew I was here. And if they were knocking instead of kicking the door in, that meant they wanted something. I reached for the handle. Paused. Then, quietly, who is it? Silence. My pulse slammed. Then, a voice. Calm. Familiar. John Monroe. My blood turned to ice. Not because of the name, because of the voice that said it. I had never heard it before. But I knew it. Somewhere deep, somewhere old. And then, the third knock. Soft. Slow. Almost gentle. Come now, detective. A pause. Let's not pretend you don't remember me. Vincent moved fast. His gun was already out, already steady. Monroe. His voice was sharp. Low. The kind of voice that meant business. Don't. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. Because the voice behind the door, the one that had spoken my name like it belonged to them, was still there. Waiting. Listening. A slow, deliberate silence. Then, a chuckle. Soft. Amused. Like I had just played right into his hands. Ah, Vincent. The name slid from the man's lips like he was tasting it. Like he had been expecting it. Like he knew him. Vincent's grip on the gun tightened. You should open the door, detective, the voice murmured, before I do it for you. I swallowed. Kept my feet planted. Because something was wrong. The way he spoke, the way he knew both our names without hesitation, wasn't right. I turned my head just slightly, eyes flicking to Vincent. Who is that? I muttered. Vincent didn't answer. Didn't take his eyes off the door. Didn't lower the gun. And that's when I realized, he knew. He knew exactly who was on the other side. And he didn't want to say the name out loud. The cold settled deep. I clenched my jaw. Vincent. My voice was low. Even. Tell me. His fingers twitched near the trigger. Then, finally, he exhaled slow. And he spoke. That's the man who put you in Blackreach last time. My breath hitched. Vincent wasn't lying. And that meant one thing. Whoever was on the other side of that door, whoever had just said my name like they had owned it once before, was the man who had rewritten me. I exhaled slow. Vincent's words still hung in the air. That's the man who put you in Blackreach last time. Last time. That meant this wasn't the first time I'd been erased, wasn't the first time I'd been changed. And now, he was here again. I clenched my jaw, squared my shoulders. Then, I reached for the handle. Vincent tensed. Monroe. I think it's time we met, I muttered. And I pulled the door open. He stood in the dim light of the hallway, hands folded neatly behind his back. Tall. Clean cut. A face made for expensive suits and well-practiced smiles. But his eyes, they were wrong. Not hollow men wrong. Not like the shifting, empty faces of things that didn't belong in this world. Worse, because his eyes were real, sharp, intelligent, cold. He was human. And that scared me more than anything else. He smiled. Calm. Controlled. John Monroe, he murmured. Or would you prefer James Holloway? The name slid from his lips like a question he already knew the answer to. My pulse pounded. Vincent stood just behind me, gun still raised, jaw clenched. But the man at the door didn't even glance at him. His focus was on me, because I was the puzzle. The mistake. The ghost that shouldn't have come back. I forced my voice even. Who the hell are you? The man's smile widened. And then, he told me. My name is Dr. Elias Voss. A pause. Then, the architect who built you. The world tilted. Like the floor had just fallen out from under me. Like I had just heard something I was never supposed to know. Voss watched my expression shift. Watched the gears turning behind my eyes. And he liked it. You were never supposed to remember, he murmured. Then, softly, like he was almost impressed, and yet, here we are. Dr. Elias Voss, an architect. The man who had rewritten me. The man who had turned James Holloway into John Monroe. I felt the name sitting in my chest like a second heartbeat, too familiar, too foreign. Like it belonged to me. Like it didn't. Boss watched me. Waiting. Then, I stepped forward. What did you do to me? Boss didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Just smiled. You want the simple answer. I clenched my jaw. Try me, he exhaled, slow. Then, I erased you. Vincent tensed beside me. Boss tilted his head. Or, rather I repurposed you. The word settled deep. Like something old, something buried was stirring. Why? I asked. Boss smiled wider. Because you asked me to. Vincent swore. That's a lie. Boss turned his gaze on him for the first time. Is it? Then, back to me. Tell me, detective, why do you think you remember more than the others? I stared. What others? Boss exhaled, almost like he was disappointed. Ah, he murmured. So they still haven't told you, have they? My blood turned cold. Vincent stiffened. Because that meant he knew. And he hadn't told me. I exhaled sharp. Turned to Vincent. Tell me what he means. Vincent's jaw ticked. He didn't speak. Didn't meet my gaze. Which meant he had known the truth this entire time. Boss smiled. Don't blame him, detective. Some truths are difficult to accept. Then, he stepped forward. Leaned in and spoke the words that split my world apart. You weren't the first version of yourself. You were the third. The room spun. My breath caught. The name inside my head, James Holloway, felt like it was cracking. Because if I was the third, that meant there was a first. A version of me I had never met. A version of me I had been built from. Vincent muttered a curse, dragging a hand down his face. Boss just smiled. Would you like to know who you were before James Holloway? The room felt too small. Too fragile. Because some part of me already knew the answer. And I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. I could feel the answer hanging in the air. Waiting. Ready to split my world apart. Boss's smile never wavered. Vincent stood stiff beside me, his fingers still curled too tightly around his gun, like he wanted to shoot something, but wasn't sure what. Or maybe, who. I forced myself to breathe. Then, I made my choice. Not now, I muttered. I don't have time for the past, Boss chuckled. Ah. A man who still believes he has control over his own story. Fascinating. I ignored him. Turned to Vincent. We're going to Blackreach, tonight. Vincent's jaw tightened. Monroe. I cut him off. No more games. No more riddles. We find her. We end this. Vincent hesitated. Then, he exhaled sharp. All right, he muttered. Let's do it. Boss's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked amused. Well, he murmured. This should be interesting. Then, he stepped aside. Gestured toward the hallway. After you. The road stretched into the dark. Twisting. Endless. Like it didn't want us to reach the end. Blackreach Sanitarium sat at the edge of the city, past the Hollow Men's old territory, past the places the Eye of Vespara controlled. It wasn't just a hospital. It was a prison for the forgotten. I stared through the windshield as the gates loomed ahead. Tall iron things that looked too much like a mouth waiting to close. Vincent drove in silence, his fingers gripping the wheel too tightly. Boss sat in the back, watching the road like a man who already knew what was waiting for us. The moment we stopped at the gate, Vincent killed the engine. Ready, I exhaled. No. But I opened the door anyway. So did Vincent. Boss just smirked. Welcome back, detective. Then, the gates opened on their own. The moment we stepped inside, the world changed. The air felt thick. The walls seemed too tall. A hum filled the hallways, not mechanical. Not natural. Like the bones of Blackreach were alive. Like they were waiting. Vincent tensed beside me. This place isn't right. No shit. We moved deeper. Step by step, past rooms with no numbers, past doors that didn't need locks, because the people inside weren't leaving. Then, I saw it. The hallway. The one from my vision. Vincent followed my gaze. You recognize this place? I nodded once. Then, I saw the door. At the very end of the corridor. And on it, a name. Not Monroe. Not Holloway. The name that had come before both of them. Mine. Vincent inhaled sharply. Jesus. Boss chuckled. Ah. Memories returning, are they? I clenched my fists, stepped forward. Because I had come here looking for the woman in red. But now. I wasn't sure who I was trying to save anymore. I reached for the handle. And pulled the door open. Inside the room, a chair. A single light. And sitting in it, me. A version of myself I had never seen before. One that had been left behind. One that had never escaped. His eyes flicked up, met mine, and then he smiled. "Took you long enough." My pulse slammed against my ribs. Vincent muttered something under his breath. Voss, he just watched, like he had been waiting for this moment. Like he had seen it before. I stepped closer. "Who are you?" The man in the chair, the man with my face, my voice, my memories, tilted his head. "Isn't that the question?" I exhaled. "Cut the riddles. I want answers." His grin widened. "Then ask the right questions, detective." I felt the name hollowly sitting on my tongue, but I didn't say it, because I wasn't sure if it belonged to him. Or to me. Instead, I asked the only thing that mattered. "Where is she?" His smile faded. His eyes flicked to Voss, then back to me. "Close," he murmured. "But if you've made it this far," he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, "then you already know that she isn't just missing." His voice dropped lower. "She's being rewritten." The word sank deep. Vincent swore. "Then we're out of time." Voss smirked. "Ah. Now you understand." I clenched my fists. I had come here to save her. But now, I wasn't sure which of us was running out of time. I swallowed. "Where is she?" The man with my face finally stood, and he spoke the last truth I ever wanted to hear. "She's in the room where they made me." And then, I remembered. Everything. The first version of me. The second. And what I had lost along the way. I didn't hesitate. I didn't flinch. Because whatever Voss had planned, whatever this place wanted from me, I wasn't leaving her behind. I stared at the man with my face, the man who had been left behind in this hell. "Then take me there." He tilted his head. His smile flickered, just for a second. Not amusement. Not malice. Recognition. "You sure about that, detective?" Vincent tensed beside me. "Monroe, don't, I'm sure." The version of me in the chair nodded. Slow. Final. He stepped toward the door. His steps didn't echo. They never did in Blackreach. The walls swallowed sound like they were hungry. Vincent swore under his breath and followed. And Voss, he didn't stop us, he just grinned. Because to him, this was all part of the design. The air felt thicker the deeper we went. The hum that had been faint before was louder now. Not a sound, a vibration, a pulse. Like Blackreach had a heartbeat. Like the building itself was alive. We passed locked doors. No numbers. No names. Just plain steel. But I felt them. The ones inside. The forgotten. The rewritten. I focused on what mattered. We stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall. It was plain. Unmarked. But I knew it. I had seen it in my dreams. In flashes of memories that didn't belong to me but always felt like they did. The man with my face placed a hand on the door. Then, he looked at me. "You ready for the truth?" I exhaled. "Open it." The door creaked open. The hum grew louder. And there she was. The woman in red. Sitting in a chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were closed. Her skin was pale, like she hadn't seen sunlight in years. But it was her. She was still there. I took a step forward. Rachel. Her eyes fluttered. Opened. And when she looked at me, she didn't recognize me. My chest tightened. "It's me." She frowned. "Who?" I staggered back. The man with my face didn't say anything. Because he didn't need to. I already knew. They had been rewriting her. Turning her into someone else. The process wasn't complete, but it was close. And if I didn't stop it now, she'd be gone for good. I forced the panic down. Forced myself to think. There was a control panel on the wall. Old, industrial, covered in switches and dials. I didn't know how it worked, but I didn't have to. I turned to Vincent. "Help me shut this thing down." He hesitated. Then, he nodded. We moved fast, pulling levers, flipping switches. The hum grew louder, angrier, like the building itself was fighting back. Voss's voice echoed behind us. "Careful, detective. If you shut it off the wrong way." I ignored him, because I wasn't leaving her here. Not again. I pulled the final switch. The hum stopped. Silence. Then, Rachel gasped. Her body jerked, her eyes wide, panicked. I was at her side in an instant. "Rachel, it's me." She blinked. Her breathing was ragged, her gaze unfocused. But then, recognition. She saw me. "Monroe." Her voice was weak. "Yeah, it's me." Her hand trembled as she reached for mine. I grabbed it, held on. "I thought they took you," she whispered. I shook my head. "Not this time. Not ever again." We left Blackreach behind. The gates closed behind us, and for the first time in what felt like years, I could breathe. Rachel leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. Vincent drove in silence, and Voss, he was gone. For now, but I knew he'd be back, because men like him don't disappear. They wait. They plan, they build. But this time, I'd be ready. Because I wasn't just John Monroe. I was James Holloway. And I remembered everything.